Welcome back to my video series on patching the Doepfer Modular system. Today I'm hoping that we can wrap up with an overview of how I've patched the system, the components in it, and how they all work together, and some ideas about the decisions that I made in order to come up with a compromise between the huge number of obstructing patch cables and a useful polyphonic modular instrument. We'll start today by just a quick description of what's in the case. So since I first purchased and started building the system over a year ago, I'm now running the Doepfer Modular in two Mantis cases. The bottom case is primarily controllers with a whole series of synthwork faders that control different pertinent, important parameters across the synth. And then there's some extra patching like an Intelligent Shifty, the new Doepfer clocked random quad module, as well as the Doepfer A190-5 polyphonic MIDI to CV interface that's here on the end. The top case is primarily the meat and potatoes of the synth. That's where all the oscillators, filters, amps, and envelopes all hang out. So I'll just take us briefly through how I laid that out first, because that's where I started when I was designing this system. So on the top, over on the far left side, is where I call number one, or oscillator number one, sits. And oscillator number one, as well as oscillator number two that's under it, are controlled in part by the Doepfer octal voltage controlled switch. And what that switch does is it takes signals from either one of the polyphonic envelopes or from a quad LFO, patches them into one side of the switch. The other side of the switch is a fixed voltage that is attached to one of two faders here in the controller section. And then when I switch across that switch, what it lets me do is determine what modulation signals are going to control either the pulse width of oscillator number one or control its frequency. And I've got this voltage controlled switch, octal switch, doing the same thing for what I call oscillator 2, which is under here. So for example, if I wanted to do PWM with oscillator number one, then what I do is I just switch over, and then four of those, because it's a programmable switch, the top four of those switches switch over, and now I've got four slow running Doepfer LFOs. You can barely see them hidden away in here, and their job is simply to provide modulation for pulse width so that I get a PWM sound on what I call voice layer number one, which starts with oscillator one. So we can hear in the background of our arpeggio, now we've got pulse width modulation running, and it's polyphonic pulse width modulation. Each single voice of the four voices has its own modulating LFO. So then from there, the outputs of oscillator number one, and there's three outputs. There's a triangle output, a sawtooth output, and the pulse, square or pulse width modulation output. I wanted to be able to have some control over the mix of those analog waveforms for maximum flexibility. So then I've got two sets of Doepfer three-way manual crossfaders, and so they'll crossfade between an A, B, and C position. And so on top here you see these four knobs are the crossfaders for oscillator number one, and then in under here on the second row, oscillator number two has its own set of crossfaders. They're hard to see, but you can reach at them here under the cables. So right now I've got oscillator number one set with all these controls over to the pulse, so we're listening to its pulse. If I go all the way over to the end, now we've got triangle waves coming out of oscillator number one into our filter. So I'm going to go back to the PWM. So then the output of those crossfaders then heads on in to the A105-4, which is Doepfer's polyphonic 24 dB low-pass filter, and so we're listening to the patch in the background. We're listening to that filter, filtering those 4 waveforms, each through its own filter path, because it's a poly filter, so there's 4 filters behind one faceplate. And then under this whole mess of cables is 2 sets of the new Doepfer A130-8, which is a stack of 8 VCAs that I've got set to be in linear mode. And essentially what they're doing is they are the modulation control source and the mixer for the modulation signals that control the 4 filters under the A105-4. So in these VCAs, I've got all kinds of different signals coming in. For example, like the envelope. So again, on my top row, which I call layer number 1, I've got a filter number 1 ADSR. So I've got one of the new A141-4 Polyphonic ADSRs. So it gets 4 gate inputs from the Doepfer MIDI to CV interface, and you can almost see it. You can see the round robin effect as the gates from the arpeggiator kind of move throughout. And then it provides 4 different envelopes, but set to the same parameter values from the set of controls on the front, and those 4 envelope outputs go into the VCAs. They're mixed with other controllers like keyboard tracking, that sort of thing. And then the output, there are 4 mix outputs from those 2 sets of VCAs that then go back into the filter, and that's what controls the filter. So to hear that in motion, if I go to my controllers on the bottom, I can grab a slider that lowers the frequency of filter 1, and then I can grab a slider that opens up the envelope. And then we'll hear those envelopes. So we can now hear the effect of the filter 1 ADSR on that filter. And as I change the controllers down on the bottom case, I can control the amount of envelope that's controlling that filter, and I can open up all 4 of those filters just with one of the faders. I also have another fader that's assigned to key track, and so that fader is simply a voltage that splits off in a mult that's back here, goes back into 4 of those mixer amps, so it's just functioning like an offset and has for its input signals tapped off of the keyboard outs. So then this is what I'm using to control this filter. Now moving along down my chain, once we get past the filter, the audio signal then pops into 2 Doepfer mini voltage controlled crossfaders, and they're 2 little 4 HP modules here. So what it does, this voltage control crossfader will take 2 signals and allow you to crossfade an A and a B into 1 output. And in this case, because I have 2 of them and each of them is dual, I've got 4 channels of this crossfading going on. So this is what I use to crossfade across the output of this filter, which is my layer 1 filter, and the filter on the bottom, which is my layer 2 filter. And so then it also comes out, and we'll take a look at it in a bit, goes into the crossfaders, and then from the crossfaders they head into the final VCA. And the final VCA gets its control signals from a second ADSR, a second A141-4, and this ADSR is patched in to just control that VCA and nothing else. So then I've got a whole second layer to the synth that's laid out in a very similar way, and its output heads into this crossfader, and then the outputs, the 4 outputs from these crossfaders, go into this amp. So then I need some way to be able to control what I'm listening to out of the crossfader, and I do that with this final synthwork fader. If it's in the up position, then we're listening to voice 1, our voice 1 layer. If I move it to the down position, then what we hear is layer number 2. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube videos. Please consider joining my Patreon to help me in my patching experiments and to help me make more weird modular music. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.